that mysticism and art interact. One is art as a catalyst for mystical experience. That is to say, the art induces some type of contemplation or mystical insight or something. Now, I'm saying art here, but you could include music and ritual and lots of other things. Okay? That is non-verbal means of communication. So, for example, the contemplation of an icon and praying before an icon can be used as a catalyst for mystical experience. This is described in lots of different mystical sources. The second thing is using art to express mystical experiences or mystical truths of some sort. Now, that we see, it appears in medieval times, but it really expands in Renaissance and Baroque times when art becomes more individualistic and naturalistic, and rather than stylized and repeating the same thing over and over again. So if you went to a medieval church, you'd see the same type of images of the crucifixion. When you get into Renaissance and Baroque times, they become highly individualized. Still, it's the crucifixion scene, but it's changing. Now, the question here is the art done by a mystic? That is, does a mystic make an artistic representation of his experiences? Or is it an artist who's been inspired by a mystic, either verbally or from a text or a story or something? So those are two ways that the art, art inspired or as an expression of mysticism differ. We have a lot more of art inspired by mystics rather than art created by mystics. The most famous mystical artist is probably William Blake, who was late 18th, early 19th century poet, artist, and so forth. But there's other things as well. And in some ways, the Baroque art style is an attempt to institutionalize mystical themes within art. Okay? Now, I'm going to take two examples of this from Rome, where I was fortunate to spend July this year. And the first is we're going to look at Ignatius of Loyola and a painting by Bacchia. He's a Baroque artist, not one of the famous ones, but this particular case he did an amazing thing with his art. Now, this is the church called the Gesù, which means the Jesus Church. It was founded by the Jesuits, and it became their headquarters as the movement receives more and more patronage by the official church. So the Society of Jesus starts as a small group of mystics, doing their thing, and it becomes very popular, spreads. Ignatius of Loyola is the founder, Spanish mystic, and he ends up in Rome, where he is patronized by and accepted by some of the elites of the Catholic Church, and end up building this Baroque church. So that's the exterior. Now the interior has paintings in a cycle of events from St. Ignatius's life. And here's one of his mystical experiences. You can see him bowing here in prayer. This is Ignatius. Nice bald head. You can always recognize him in the paintings. And then here is his vision of Christ and the cross. So that's what he saw. And then these things surrounding here are the angels. Now, notice these angels are more adult angels. You'll see the late Baroque switching over more to these. These are called cherubs by the late Baroque, or they're called cherubs by people. They're actually called putti by the Italians of the era, but they come to be called the cherub. So you read the Bible, the cherub is a type of angel. So that's how they get represented. Basically, children's heads with wings around them. And then up here is the Father seated in his throne in heaven, who's kind of overseeing this. So he sees the Father and Christ and so forth. So that is a painting based on one of his mystical experiences from his spiritual autobiography. I am not sure which one it is, but and you can see how the style is very Baroque, but the theme is purely mystical. Now this is a different, this is the ceiling at the top that's by Boccaccio. And it's one of the most amazing murals in, church murals in Rome. It's a ceiling mural, but he did it in a three-dimensional style so that although this seems like the building's going up higher, it's all a trick. It's all illusion through perspective and so forth. It's really amazing to walk around and look at this, because that looks just like, here's the top of the arch, and the building just goes on up to another arch. But in fact, he's depicting heaven. The church is extending on up into heaven. The roof of the church opens up, and it goes on up into heaven. And then surrounding this are all sorts of angels and beings, spiritual beings, maybe saints and so forth. And then in the middle here, you have Saint Ignatius, who's being carried up on the clouds. This is the exaltation of Saint Ignatius, that is, he's becoming a saint. And then in the center here, let me switch to a close-up. I had a telephoto when I was taking this, so we got some more detail with some of this. But here's Saint Ignatius, and then here is his vision of the sacred name of Jesus. Now, this becomes, we've talked about sacred use of names in mysticism and so forth, and the name Jesu, or the sacred name of Jesus, becomes very important in certain mystical circles at this time. So he has a vision, and it's kind of a vision of Jesus, but it's also a vision of the name. Okay, and notice now all of this again is three-dimensional illusional art, but all of these guys are just carrying him, floating up, and he's on the clouds, and he's near the center, but the real center is this vision of Christ. So it's his ascent into heaven as a saint, but it is also a depiction of a vision he had in real life, that is to say, while he was alive, which depicts, the mystical vision is a depiction of the celestial glory and ultimate beatific vision of the mystic. Does that make sense? So it is reflected on a description of a mystical experience he had that is turned into an eternal artistic representation. Okay, so that's just another way that you can see the art doing that. Here's a close-up of another panel of that. And again, you can see here's churchmen, saints, different figures, and then Ignatius is being carried up into heaven. And here is the crown. He's receiving the crown of martyrdom and so forth. The most famous example of art inspired by mystical experiences, Teresa of Avila, whose experience is depicted in sculpture, not painting. The other one was painting. This is sculpture by Bernini. Now notice, Orthodox Church does not do sculpture. They might do a painting like that, or mosaics like the ones we saw of Ignatius, but this is a sculpture by Bernini, the greatest of the Renaissance sculptors, and it depicts a vision that Teresa of Avila has, and the vision is described in this book, so we'll look at it in just a second. But here's a close-up of this, okay? Now, notice number one, you've got the attempt to recreate mystical light, because she describes all these bright, shiny lights with these golden beams. This is probably bronze painted and plated with gold. And then you have the angel here, the lance of the angel, and Teresa here, having her mystical experience. Now, this is found on, what page is it? 358 of the book. So I'm going to read it to you, and we'll point as we read to what, how the artist is depicting it. He made this piece of art direct from this mystical narrative from Teresa of Avila's, I can't remember which book it's in. Anyway, it's one of her, she had several books. I can't remember which one this comes from. But our Lord was pleased that I should have at times a vision of this kind. I saw, so notice, this is more than once. He says several times. I saw an angel close by me, on my left side, in bodily form. This I am not accustomed to see except very rarely. That is, she sees lights or something, but not a bodily angel. Though I've had visions of angels frequently, yet I see them only by an intellectual vision. Okay, so notice the difference between bodily and intellectual. It was our Lord's will that in this vision I should see the angel this way. He was not large, but small of stature and most beautiful. So notice it looks like a teenager, right? So that's how she described it. His face was burning as if one of the highest of the angels, who seems to be all of fire. So this is the fire, the light that Bernini's depicting here. They must be those whom we have called cherubim, because the fiery cherubim, Anyway, notice that it's not one of the putti yet. It's, this is still in transition of how they depict the different types of angels. Their names, they never tell me. So notice, she's seen this more than once, and the angel won't tell her the name. But I see very well that there is in heaven so great a difference between one angel and another, and between these and the others, that I cannot explain it. I saw in his hand a long spear of gold. Okay? And at the iron's point, there seemed to be a little fire. He appeared to me to be thrusting it at times at my heart. So there's the angel, he's got the spear, and he's thrusting it at her heart, to pierce my very entrails. When he drew it out, he seemed to draw them out also. That is, he stabbed it in her and then pulled it out, and leave me all on fire with the great love of God. So again, the beams of light and fire there in the background. The pain was so great that it made me moan. Now notice, she talks about pain and bliss simultaneously. She's suffering great pain, and yet it makes her happy. So just bear that in mind, that it's not necessarily all wonderful stuff. It can be painful. And yet so surprising that the sweetness of this excessive pain, that I could not wish to be rid of it. The soul is satisfied now with nothing less than God. It is a caressing of love so sweet that it now takes place between my soul and God. Okay? So notice, this is how the artist depicted that scene. And again, as I said, Baroque is an attempt in many ways to depict through art mystical experience. Now, this is made famous in part by Da Vinci Code, where it's one of the things in the Da Vinci Code book. I don't know if you ever read that, but it's also made famous because it's such a spectacular work of art, and it's also famous because a lot of people interpret this in an erotic fashion, that somehow this is an erotic dream she's having that she's interpreting as mystical experience or something. So, there's all sorts of commentary and stuff on this. Now, this is the context of this particular piece of art. It's in a side chapel off Santa Maria della Vittoria, and here is the experience. So I took a head-on shot of this from the other angle. But here it's from the side, and you can see these guys are watching. And there's another group watching from the other side. And these are like other mystics and churchmen who are participating somehow in Teresa's experience. So notice watching the image is a mystical experience in and of itself. And he's depicting the mystical experiences derived from the mystical experience in the art depicting the Teresa's rapture. Okay? Does that make sense to people? Any questions on that? So that's just a couple of examples of what I'm talking about in terms of the relationship between art and mysticism. But there's lots of other ones that could be looked at, and we also examined the painting of Saint Francis receiving the stigmata as another painting derived from a mystical experience. Okay, we've been talking about deification a bit, and we need to just clarify a couple of ideas. Number one, deification is a very early Christian doctrine. It appears in the New Testament in a vague sort of way, and then appears in the earliest church fathers in very definite terms. The question is, what is the nature of deification? What does it mean? Now, the earliest Christians seem to be talking about deification as the exalted, resurrected state of the believer. So you die, and when you're resurrected, you are resurrected with this eternal body, an immortal body, and it's called deification. Okay? The mystics start to equate deification with their mystical experiences, and it is something you can experience now. So there is definitely changes and shifts in conceptualization of this idea. Okay? And one big issue that arises is deification post-resurrection or during this life? And secondly, is it the same thing as union? Or can you have a union without deification? Can you have deification without a mystical union? Do you see what I mean? Those two concepts get conflated, and they debate what they mean. Now, the ideas of deification are much stronger in Greek Orthodoxy than in Catholicism. It fades out after the Renaissance, basically. The Protestants don't like the idea of deification because they believe it challenges the omnipotence of God, whereas the Orthodox say deification is the greatest manifestation of the omnipotence of God. If God is omnipotent, he should be able to share his nature with you, right? And this is described on page 411 in one of the readings we had, this enables God to become incarnate within him or her. So just as God is incarnate in Christ, he can become incarnate in us. And notice it's both him or her. In fulfillment of this mystery, you undergo deification by grace. And it is truly blessed because that deification has no end. So it's a permanent state. Mystical union is often understood as, an experience, and then it kind of goes away, like Teresa of Avila talked about it. But deification will last forever. And this is a Greek Orthodox statement, by the way. It is from, I think, Maximus the Confessor. For he who bestows his grace, that is God, on those who are worthy of it, that is the faithful Christians, it is himself infinite in essence. So God is this infinite being, in being, essence is being, and has the infinite and utterly limitless power to deify humanity. So God's ultimate manifestation of his omnipotence is to deify. Now, we get this deification language appearing in the New Testament in John and Paul. It is associated with the resurrection, where Paul, in his discourse on the resurrection, talks about we leave this corrupt body and receive an uncorrupt body. It is talked about as living forever. It is talked about as adoption, that God adopts us as sons and daughters, okay? And Paul also speaks of that adoption language as being joint heirs. We become joint heirs with Christ. So all of that is understood in deification terms. And then in John 1:3, we should be like him, for we shall see him as he is. That is, when we conceptualize God as he really is, we become God. And of course, the mystics seeing him as he is a mystical phenomenon. It's not, you don't see with your mortal eyes. We see this in Athanasius. This is a very famous saying quoted in lots of the Greek fathers. God became man that man might become God. Okay? And we already read some stuff from Maximus. He's 6th or 7th century monk and theologian. Okay, on 409, this is what Maximus says. God will also completely fulfill the goal of his mystical work, and probably mysterious work might be better there, of deifying humanity in every respect. So we're completely deified. Of course, short of an identity of essence with God. Now notice, God in his essence is eternal and non-created. Humans are created, so we can't have the same essence. But in every other way other than God's essence, we are deified. So it is an important mystical idea, especially in the East, but it's also an important non-mystical idea. That is, the mystics interpret it in one particular way. Now, the other question is union. And this is the idea that we become one spirit with him, and in John 17:21, we become one with God, even as God is one with Christ, and so forth. Okay? Now, there's different ways this union is understood, and we don't have time to go into all of the details, but basically there is the indistinct union where the individual remains self-conscious entity, and that's the distinct union. Excuse me, this should be distinct here. The distinct union and the indistinct union is where you completely lose track of yourself and are completely merged with God, and it's annihilation of the individual soul. So distinct union, you retain self-identity. Indistinct union, you're completely merged with God. So bear in mind those two conceptualizations of it. And then the nature of unity, of union with God is also, it's often expressed in very allegorical terms, so you can't get a grasp on what they mean, and that's probably intentional, right? Because they don't know what it means, and they're giving, trying to express in words the inexpressible. One of the big things they use is the allegory of water and the sea, and this is on page 428 from the book. This comes from Macarius. Oops, no it doesn't. It comes from, Evagrius Ponticus. It's not one of the readings, but it's a quotation in the introduction from Evagrius Ponticus, who was one of the 4th century kind of founders of monasticism. Not of the Holy Fathers, but of the organizers and systematizers of it. When the mind flows back into him, notice it's mind here. The mind flows back into God like torrents into a sea. So it's like water. You've got a river. It's flowing down. The river is distinct from the ocean, right? What happens, though? When the river hits the ocean, it merges into it, and you can no longer distinguish the river from the ocean. Okay, this is how he's talking about it. And notice this is the same description found, exact same description found in the Upanishads, the Hindu mysticisms, where the unity of the soul is like the drop of water dropping into the ocean. The soul, individual soul, is a drop of water. You hit the ocean, you still exist. That drop is still there, but it's completely absorbed in the ocean. And so here's what he says. He changes them all completely into his own nature, that is the ocean, color and taste. That is, these are the qualities of water. And as in the fusion of rivers with the sea, no addition in its nature or variation in its color or taste can be found. So the soul flows into God, and it doesn't change the nature of God, but the soul is there. It's still kind of distinct, but you can't tell. It's the fusion of the minds, notice the mind again, with the Father. No duality of natures or quaternity of person comes about. What the heck does that mean? Okay, this is related to diophysite, monophysite controversies, and quaternity of persons refers to the Trinity. There's 3 people in the Trinity. If you add a 4th, he becomes a God. Does that make 4 people in the Trinity? That is, if the mystic becomes a God. He says no. And there is no duality of natures. Now, this is monophysite versus diophysite controversy, but what he's talking about is the nature of God different than the nature of humans, and can we become God if we don't take on the nature of God? This is kind of the indistinct versus distinct issue here. Okay? So anyway, you get some of that stuff. Now, you've got, in a sense, 3 different, or even 4 different things here. One is deification, and these are overlapping concepts, but not necessarily the same. So you get the Venn diagram thing, you've got overlaps in these. Deification is one. The other is union. So can you have a union with God without being deified? Or can you be deified without having a union? Those types of questions. The other is the question of the beatific vision. This is kind of a late medieval conceptualization of essentially the vision of God is called the beatific vision. And it's beatific because it makes you blessed. Beatus is Latin for blessed, and so beatific means it turns you into a blessed state. And it's almost like you're sanctified through the vision. The question is, can you have a beatific vision without union? Can you have union without a beatific vision? So, are these the same thing, different words for the same thing, or different things? Are they partly overlapping? We mentioned St. Bernard of Clairvaux, and we had a couple of readings from him, and I mentioned, I believe, that he has a mystical hymn in our hymn book, which is Jesus, the very thought of thee. This is contemplation. With sweetness fills my breast, so it makes me happy, it makes me sweet. But greater far thy face to see in the beatific vision, and in thy presence rest in the union. Okay? So that hymn expresses Bernard's conceptualization of these things. And I forgot to mention, in addition to art and mysticism, we also have literature and mysticism. And the greatest example of that is Dante, who does the Divine Comedy. And the mystical elements of that are most prominent in the Paradiso, which nobody reads. They all want to read about the torture stuff, but they don't want to read the Paradiso. But in the last cantos or chapters of the Paradiso, he describes the beatific vision, the union, the mystical experience. All that stuff is in there in great detail in Dante's Divine Comedy. Then we also have the mystical fellowship, which means more like a communion of people, but also a communion with God. And it's not quite like union. This is more like a deep and abiding fraternity and love, but not necessarily union of essence or energies or whatever. So all of those four concepts kind of overlap and interrelate with each other. Any questions on that stuff? Dang it. What's the matter here? All right. No questions? All right. Let us look at Protestantism and mysticism a little bit, and we will explain a few key ideas. We're kind of ending, we're focusing on medieval period, so we're not going into the Protestants much, but there are some important things to note of how Protestantism changed conceptualizations of mysticism. We do have some proto-Protestant mystical groups like the Cathars who seem to have their own forms of mysticism, but were not part of the Catholic tradition. For the most part, the Cathars were viewed as heretics, and there was a crusade against them and so forth. But for the most part, probably what you actually had was individuals in little groups in monasteries and stuff that were doing kind of non-traditional, heterodox, mystical stuff, rather than whole alternate churches or movements. But the Cathars are an example then of non-Catholic Christian, that is, they're Christians, but they're not Catholics, and they're mystical stuff that's going on. Now, when the Reformers come on the scene, did I tell you it was Reformation Day a week or two ago? Yeah. When the Reformers come on the scene, they reject Catholic theology, liturgy, art, and mysticism. That is to say, they want to go back just to the Bible, and so they reject those things which they think are add-ons to the Bible. And perhaps correctly, but at any rate, so they basically do away with that tradition. They do, however, have an active spiritual life among many Protestants. The question is can it be called mysticism? I don't know that they are calling it that. They often talk more about the gifts of the Spirit rather than mystical stuff. Do you see what I'm saying? It may be the same type of thing, or it may be a different thing, and it may be the same type of thing using different names. It's hard to get a grip on this because these are all individual experiences. One thing to note, however, is the Protestant mystical tradition became highly idiosyncratic. That is to say, in the medieval mystical traditions, you generally had a master who taught you, and that master, brought you into the tradition of all the things to do and all the things to believe and what to expect in a vision and so on and so forth, right? When the Protestants come on the scene, they don't have human masters that teach them mystical practices or traditions or doctrines or anything, right? They basically have a spiritual experience which then forms a catalyst for them to come up with their own ideas. Does that make sense? So it's individualistic, that is, it's just one guy having this experience, and then it's idiosyncratic, that is, it's unique to him or her. Now, that's not to say they don't get followers and stuff. It's just to say that they're much more individualistic. Okay? So, when there are Protestant mystics, they also often form either a community or a movement or sometimes an independent church off of their mystical experiences. That's because once the authority of the universal church is undermined, it's easy to undermine the authority of the Lutherans too, right? And say, or the Anglicans, say, well, the Anglicans are just as wrong as the Catholics, and because my mystical experiences demonstrate the Anglicans are wrong. So Protestants tend to be much more interested in the theological exegesis of the Bible. That is, their sectarianism derives from theology rather than mysticism, as a rule. But that's not to say there aren't mystical Protestants who kind of form their own things. Now, some of these guys basically are flashes in the pan. That is, it's an individual who has these experiences and he doesn't form a community. Others seem to have gathered followers around them. So, for example, Boehme here has followers during his lifetime, but they don't form a different church. They form a movement, that is, like-minded individuals who like Boehme's experiences and interpret the Bible and according to them and so forth. When you get to George Fox, on the other hand, he had a whole bunch of mystical experiences, which he formed into a community of followers and believers in his thought, which then turns into a church. So first he just forms a society, the Society of Friends, meaning friends of each other and friends of God. And then ultimately, this becomes the Quakers. I mean, that's what they're called nowadays, but Society of Friends is their official term. So he founds a new church, right? And then you have a guy like Emanuel Swedenborg, who has a huge set of visions. We're going to talk about him in the Goodrick Clark book. And he forms an entirely different church too, Swedenborgianism. These are still around, both Quakers and Swedenborgs. And then William Blake is a mystic who is very heterodox and creates all this poetry and art based on his mystical experiences, but basically he's the flash in the pan type. He just is there, he explodes with all this stuff, and his wife basically thought he was crazy, and his friends, he was kind of an erratic and irascible guy, and he never formed a church. He wanted to form a church, right? Does that make sense to people? So those are broad characteristics of Protestant mysticism. Now we'll be looking at non-Christian versions in the esoteric Goodrick Clark book as well, a little bit later. So, if you want to pursue that, there's the book on Wisdom's Children that I talked about earlier. It's about kind of the theosophist, the Christian theosophist type of mystics among the Protestants. Okay? It's by Verslus, Verslus, I think. Okay. Need to talk a little bit about, are we running out of time as usual? What time is it? No clock here. Huh?
1:40.
10. Jeez. I can never get through this stuff. Okay. Mysticism and heresy. Basically, the mystics had experiences which they believed were authentic encounters with God. Those encounters taught them things. And since the experience is authentic, what it taught them is authentic. And it is superior to the theological, scholastic book theology because, they've encountered reality directly, not indirectly through a book. Joseph Smith kind of reflects this idea when he says, a man can learn more by gazing for 5 minutes in heaven than he can by reading all the theology books in the world. Something like that, Joseph Smith said. So it's that type of an idea. Now, so in some ways, mysticism can be traditional and reinforce the tradition. In other ways, it can be highly heterodox and undermine the tradition. Just depends on the circumstances, the individuals, and so forth. Now, there's lots of different ways that heresy get developed within Christianity. A theological heresy is different interpretations of the same scripture. So Luther and the Catholics argued about what's the meaning of scripture. A mystical heresy is when somebody has a new experience that they believe teaches them new truth that's contradictory to the old, orthodox truth. A moral reformation is essentially a heresy that condemns, for example, the excesses of the Catholic leadership, the immorality of the bishops, the corruption, the greed, all those types of things. Now, that can be instigated by a mystical experience. Who's the classic example of a mystic reformer who condemned the degradation of the church? Francis of Assisi, right. His fundamental thing was the church is too rich, it's too corrupt. The true followers of Christ will give all their money away. They won't gather and live in huge palaces and stuff. Christ said, give all you have to the poor and come follow me. So he was a strong anti-Catholic, anti-corruption in the church. Now, in fact, his movement gets co-opted by the church. Okay? Other movements might not. It just depends on the circumstances. And then the other problem is unregulated mysticism, which is to say, most medieval mystics, at least that survive, are part of a broader tradition. Unregulated mystic is a guy who just kind of blasts off and won't pay attention to the doctrines or the teachings of the church and so forth. Okay? Now, some mysticism is about individuals and small groups, and basically that's not a problem for the institutional church. Some mysticism is about reform, like Francis trying to reform the corruption of the church. If the church will admit there are corruptions, then a mystical reformer can be accepted into the church. But some forms of mysticism just create heresy, and it's rejected by the church. So it just depends, on all sorts of circumstances. Now here's the problem. Here's the nutshell of the problem. If visions, the visions and revelations and mystical experiences of a mystic are legitimate and valid only if they are consistent with the tradition of the church, that is, Catholic tradition. Okay? If they're not consistent, then they're wrong. The problem is, of course, what if the tradition is wrong? That is, the mystics will often claim the tradition is wrong, and I know that because my mystical experiences trumps your, some old geezer from 100 years ago writing a theological textbook. Okay? So that's a fundamental problem, and in a sense, it is a priori assumption by the institutional church that only those mystics are legitimate if they agree with the institutional church. So this can create then problems for mystics who don't agree. For example, you have a guy named Savonarola in Florence in the late 19th century who was an apocalyptic preacher. He had visions, he had dreams. He created what is known as the bonfire of the vanities, where they created giant bonfires and told everybody to bring all your vanities, your fancy clothes, your whatever, just jewelry, anything that makes you vain, and burn them there. So we now kind of have that term bonfire of the vanities when people are trying to get rid of the corrupt things of life. At any rate, he was preaching, he had prophecies, he had visions, etc., etc. He had completely taken over Florence. And the Pope, however, Pope Borgia, Alexander Borgia, he hated him because he was preaching against Alexander Borgia as an extraordinarily corrupt pope, which he certainly was, and he has him burned at the stake for a heretic. Okay? Classic example of a reformer mystic who becomes a heretic versus Francis, a reformer mystic who is co-opted and absorbed into the institutional church. And a lot depends on, who's in charge of the church at the time. Savonarola might have made it if there had been a different pope. You see what I mean? It might not have been condemned and burned at the stake. There's also the problem that the mystics themselves recognize, and that is the problem of false mysticism. That is, everybody agreed that there were true spiritual experiences and false spiritual experiences. This was a universal assumption at the time. The false spiritual experiences are generally thought to be demonic in some way, but could just be, a human error. But generally they would say these are visions. Everybody agrees you're having a vision, mystic, Mr. Mystic. Question is your vision caused by God, or is your vision caused by the devil? That's the question. So the devil can give false visions, false spiritual experiences, whatever. And this derives from the New Testament, where Paul says that Satan can appear as an angel of light, right? So, that would indicate that an angelic vision could be a false vision. So everybody agreed that's possible, and so the question was simply, you can, say the guy who you disagree with is false mystic, false prophet, false visionary, whatever, right? Or even worse, he's inspired by the devil. Now this, of course, in theory, undermines the whole thing, because if a mystic can err, if your vision can be false, is mysticism inherently unreliable? How do you know? How do you determine who's the true mystic and who's the false mystic? You see how that would become problematic? And so for the Protestants, it's all false, right? All these Catholic mystics were false mystics. Simple. Problem solved. Anyways, that makes sense to people. The last thing to note is the Inquisition, how the Inquisition gets involved in all of this. Are we out of time? I didn't bring my watch. I left it home. Okay. Inquisition means investigation. It's not an evil, terrible term. It just means let's try to figure out what this guy's preaching. Now, the Dominicans in the 13th and 14th century and beyond were kind of the focus of teaching. They were the teaching arm of the church. So they got associated with these investigations into false doctrine. Okay? Who's preaching false doctrine? And basically, when we talk about the Inquisition in the 16th century, this is associated with Protestant heresies. Okay? Now notice, the Protestants did their Inquisitions, the Catholics did theirs. And the key ingredient here is not that they would torture people to get them to tell, what they really believed, although that happened. The key ingredient was that heresy is a political act. And so that's why heretics got burned at the stake and executed and imprisoned and so forth, because heresy is a political act, right? It's much more like, are you a communist? Are you a member of the Communist Party? To be a heretic was like to be a communist in the 50s. It meant you were fundamentally disloyal to the state and to society and culture as a whole, and that you were not only that, but you were allied with an enemy, right? That is, Lutheran Germany or whatever it might be. So there's all sorts of problems involved with the Inquisition. But one of the things the Inquisition is doing is to try to investigate these mystics and see if they were right or wrong in their mysticism, true or false mystics, right? The classic example here is Eckhart, who is a German Dominican. Notice he's a Dominican himself, who does all these mystical sermons in German. And they have all sorts of ideas in them that the church rejected. And there's a list of some of his... What they do is make a list of false ideas. And then they go to the mystic and say, do you believe this? And if he says, yeah, then fine, that's a false idea. If he says, no, I don't believe it, you got it wrong, here's what I really believe, then they'd correct that. And then they'd see, well, is he, got too many false ideas in here? And what they tried to do is basically say, well, these are false ideas, you should recant them. You don't believe them anymore. And lots of times they'd say, okay, I don't believe those ideas anymore. Other times they'd say, no, you're wrong, my idea is true, and they'd be recalcitrant. Now, notice Eckhart makes a distinction in the question of heresy. He says, I am able to be in error, but I cannot be a heretic. For the first belongs to the intellect, that is, I may be mistaken, but I am not. The second is to the will, that is, I'm not trying to purposefully, openly oppose the church. I may be wrong in my doctrine. So that was kind of an important distinction that they tried to come up with. Now, part of the problems with mysticism and the Inquisition is that the mystical language in discussions and stuff is obscure, it's ambiguous, it's impossible to understand, okay? And so, anybody could read that and completely misunderstand it, and the mystic's in big trouble. So part of the problem was that these Inquisition guys get in trouble with the mystical guys get in trouble with the Inquisition because their language is so vague, and the Inquisition is just focused on theological minutia, all these little distinctions and stuff, and the mystics on all about how this glorious experience I had, and then the heresy hunters can find heresy in almost any mystic because the language is so vague. And that gives us this quotation here. It ordinarily happens that those who write mystical theology, that their expressions are blamed by some and praised by others because they are not taken by anyone in the same sense. Everybody understands it differently. So that creates another way in which the mystics can become heresized or turned into heretics. Okay? So I'll see you on Friday.